Okay, it's 7 o'clock and we are recording. David, do you want to do the introductory?
Yeah. Thank you. Good evening, everybody. This is David Shuey. I'm chairman of the Board of Supervisors in East Goshen Township. And we're extremely excited as we continue our outreach in the community regarding sustainability topics to learn about all our resources, not only in our county, but in our neighboring townships. So we're excited tonight to have our neighbors in Willistown join us for a program that's really important, particularly at this time of the year. It's a perfect timing for this seminar as we're all beginning to look at our lawns beginning to green through the rain. So I'm pleased to have this as part of our program. I'll remind everybody that this is a part of a series of seminars we've done through the Sustainability Advisory Committee. All of our previous seminars are available on our website under the Sustainability Advisory Committee tab. And this recording will also be available on that on the website under sustainability. So please avail yourself of these really valuable seminars. They've ranged in topics from recycling to hazardous waste to gardening to and tonight we're going to talk about lawns. So thank you very much for being in attendance. Christy.
Hello, everyone. I'm thrilled that we are starting a partnership with Willistown Conservation Trust. They are an invaluable resource that overlaps a number of our communities, but we're very grateful that they are part of East Goshen's location as well. And we are privileged tonight to have with us Lauren McGrath, who has been the director of the Watershed Protection Program at the Willistown Conservation Trust since 2017. And Lauren comes to us from Ursinus College with a BA Bachelor of Science, focusing on independent research on the impact of fracking and what it has done to the macroinvertebrate population. And Lauren has a Master of Environmental Studies from UPenn. And she studied the aquatic macroinvertebrates, and she's also worked at the Stroud Water Research Center. So it's been 10 years now since she's been studying aquatic ecology in Pennsylvania directly. So we're thrilled to have her. And we have already received a number of questions from our audience, but there is another way that you can ask live questions tonight. If you will post in the Q&A section on the top of your screen, after Lauren gives us her slide presentation, she'll be able to take questions at that point. So feel free to post in the Q&A at any point tonight. Thank you. Lauren, it's all yours.
Thank you so much, Christy and David. And let me just reiterate how excited I am to be here speaking with you tonight about this very important topic of lawns in our environment. So before I get into the talk, I would like to take one moment to talk about the Goshen Tree Tenders program. So unfortunately, Eunice Alexander, who runs the Goshen Tree Tenders, was unable to be here tonight. But if you haven't heard of the Goshen Tree Tenders before, their mission is to grow the woody cover, meaning trees and shrubs, of the Goshen area, meaning both East and West Goshen. So if you're interested in learning more about planting or maintaining trees, you can become a tree tender. And I'm very proud to say that I have my tree tender certification. It's an amazing program for people who are 18 and over. And there's still availability to sign up for their May training seminar, which takes place every Wednesday evening from 6 to 8 in May. and costs about $40. And it's really, really valuable for learning more about the biology of trees and what it takes to plant and maintain native trees in our area. So the Goshen tree tenders have been doing a lot of work in the greater Goshen area, including a live staking project on a stream bank. And they are also participating this Arbor Day in West Goshen. They also have the Keep East Goshen Beautiful Day this Saturday on April 17th. And we're very excited to have them join the trust for a tree planting event in the last week of May at our preserve called Ashbridge Preserve, which is located in East Goshen, just off of Strasburg Road. There's also going to be a Tree Tenders hosted tree planting event in November. So if you're interested in learning more, please don't hesitate to reach out to Eunice Alexander at elatoad64@gmail.com. To learn more about the Goshen Tree Tenders, you can visit their website, goshenpt.wordpress.com, or the next door group, Tree Tending in East and West Goshen. So check them out. They're really, really amazing people, really friendly, and there's a wealth of information that you can learn that will get you started tonight with the discussion of lawn care. So I'm a representative of Willistown Conservation Trust, and we are a small land trust located just down the road. Our office is located at the intersection of Providence and Goshen Road in Newtown Square. And although we started as a land trust, our mission has always really been to connect people to the land. So our goal is really to develop a lifelong passion for the environment. And so through our land protection efforts, we have created 3 preserves that are open to the public 365 days of the year. And we've also developed a number of diverse program areas in an attempt to connect people to the landscape through a number of different avenues. So I'm a representative of the Watershed Protection Program, which is the newest program area at the Trust, and we focus on the health and water quality of the headwaters of the Ridley, Crum, and Darby Creeks. But we also have an amazing habitat stewardship program, and we have volunteer days every Thursday where you can join our talented stewardship staff to learn more about trail maintenance, invasive species removal, and native plants. We have a regenerative agriculture program located on Rushton Woods Preserve is our Rushton farm. And our agroecologist team, led by farmer Fred DeLong, feeds over 150 families through a CSA and donates over 30,000 pounds of food annually to food cupboards and cabinets in our county. We also have an amazing bird conservation program where our scientists are monitoring the health and well-being of migratory songbirds in the spring and fall, as well as saw-whet owls. So if you want to learn more about volunteer opportunities, educational opportunities, and how to get involved in our organization, please head over to wctrust.org to learn more. So now for the moment we've all been waiting for, let's talk about lawns. So this talk is going to be structured to really be educational. It is not my goal to shame anyone who prefers the look of lawns or to cast any guilt on homeowners who may not have an option for how their property is maintained. Say if they have a homeowner association or other regulatory body that dictates how they should be maintaining their lawns. This is to really empower you to start to recognize small changes that we can make that will benefit the health and water quality in our local streams. So, lawns, they're ubiquitous. It's really common to enter a developed area and see a lush green uniform carpet surrounding every household. It is so common that I looked up some of the statistics and was blown away at how much lawn exists in the United States. And for the purpose of this talk, we will just be focusing on statistics from the United States. Lawns are a global phenomenon, but for today, we're just going to keep it fairly local and look just at the continental US. So American residential lawns could be considered their own biome. They take up 49,000 square miles, which is an area equivalent to the entire country of Greece. And that's just for residential lawns. If we expand that definition to include all turf grass areas, which can include parks, athletic fields, golf courses, and so on, that area increases to over 62,500 square miles of lawn in the entire continental United States. That is 2% of all land in the United States is dedicated to lawns, which is a really, really hard to imagine scope, right? You could consider lawns they're in their own biome at this size. So it's important to know how much lawn is in the United States, because in comparison to other crops that are irrigated, things like corn and soybeans, the United States lawns cover 3 times more area than any irrigated crop. And that's really important because lawns require a lot of water. So this is an average for across the country. Half of homeowner water use is dedicated to maintaining a lawn. If you live in a more arid environment, say like California, it can be well over half of the water use in a household. Lawns require more irrigation than any agricultural crop grown in the country. So there's 3 times more space being taken up by lawns, and it requires more water. And it's really important to put this into the context of agricultural crops, because lawns do not provide any nutritional benefit. You can't, harvest it and turn it into a salad the way you could for lettuces, or turn it into food for consumption. And we also use a lot of chemicals to maintain the perfect lawn. Over 80 million pounds of fertilizers and pesticides are used on lawns every year in the United States. And that gets expensive. And we spend as much as $60 billion, billion with a B, to maintain our green landscape that is not used for food and does not serve, much purpose other than an aesthetic. So how did we get to this place where we're using so many resources to maintain this green open space? Lawns actually have a lot of historic significance. And the history of lawns is something that's really fascinating. And if you think it's interesting, I would encourage you to do more research, because this barely scratches the surface. Lawns originated all the way back in the Middle Ages by French and English aristocrats. And originally they served as just open fields that were maintained at a low cut, so you could see if any armies were approaching you. It made it difficult to sneak up on buildings and estates, but that eventually turned into this opulent display of wealth, where you actually, as a homeowner, did not need to farm the land that you owned, and you had so much excess money that you could hire people to maintain the lawn. And remember, this is in an age before lawnmowers, so these close cut and beautifully maintained lawns were managed using scythes oftentimes. And so when the United States was established as a country, this very interesting transition happened where we wanted to avoid this traditional European household style where backyards were fenced in and individualized, and rather to truly embody democracy, developments should have several houses sharing one green space that is maintained mutually in a true embodiment of our Constitution. So one of the major architects in creating this concept of a park-like atmosphere was Frank J. Scott, and he literally wrote the book on this subject in 1870, saying a smooth, closely shaven surface of grass is by far the most essential element of beauty in the grounds of a suburban house. Let your lawn be your home's velvet robe, and your flowers its not too promiscuous decoration. based on this description of a landscape architect, it has hugely influenced our perception of what a suburban house should be, that a well-maintained lawn is a requirement. And it has come to the point where in new developments, you would actually ship in turf grass and lay it on down on top of the ground as if you were putting carpet down. A well-maintained lawn signifies a well-mannered household that values the community's property values and is generally a good person. And I'm not saying that just flippantly. This is actual psychological analysis of the perception of lawns. It's actually sounds so true that in sitcoms, you would if you saw, say, a lawn like this being displayed, you would automatically have a bias that the homeowners are maybe rowdy, maybe they don't care so much about the neighbors, they might be a little chaotic. If that was your assumption, you'd be right, because this is a screenshot grabbed from the mid-2000s sitcom Malcolm in the Middle. And if you've seen that show, you know that this family was pretty much the embodiment of chaos, and they never acknowledged their lawn. However, often would pan from the well-maintained and mowed properties on either side to a lot of loud noise and screaming coming from this particular property. So, a number of historic events in the United States have led to this perception of a lush green lawn. The first of which was the chemical boom. So post-World War II, there was a surplus of fertilizer in the 1950s. And we saturated the agricultural market, who was consuming a lot of this nitrogen-rich fertilizer, and companies began to promote the use of these chemical fertilizers on lawns. This coincided with the invention and proliferation of the color TV, which led us to perceive that in a suburban setting, a well-maintained green lawn was a necessity. So interestingly, very early on with the widespread use of chemical fertilizers came the understanding that too much fertilizer led to a decrease in water quality. And in Chautauqua Lake in New York in 1955, it was noted that too much fertilizer use on surrounding properties led to eutrophication. And eutrophication is the rapid growth of algae in a water body. And while the growth itself isn't necessarily a problem, when it dies, it consumes all of the oxygen in the water, which can lead to really rapid fish kills and degradation of water quality. Fascinatingly, the solution was not use less fertilizer. Instead, they dealt with their eutrophication problem by dumping mass amounts of pesticides into the stream to stop the algae from growing. So they recognized the problem and found a different solution than maybe we would have gone with today. So from 1949 to 1964, the non-farm fertilizer market grew to over $300 million. Something that was also happening at the same time was this environmental movement. But interestingly, the movement in the 60s led to regulations in the 70s and 80s with the technology to monitor and measure excess nutrients and chemicals entering waterways wasn't in place for anything other than point source pollution. So point source means coming right, you know exactly where it's coming from, a pipe perhaps at a wastewater treatment plant or in a chemical production facility. So we were able to quickly identify those point sources and begin regulating how they were discharging into waterways. But we weren't very good at dealing with non-point source pollution. So runoff from farms and from yards that are harder to trace and harder to track where contamination is coming from. And so despite all of these efforts and rapid improvements in water quality, the focus on yards has not really been in the mainstream so far. So I want to take a second to really tease apart a couple of things. So I've mentioned fertilizers, I've mentioned chemical fertilizers, but what am I talking about? So a fertilizer is something that is used to feed plants and soil. The fertilizers on the market usually contain nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in some relationship to one another. So you can get equal parts nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, usually noted on fertilizer bags as NPK, and the percentages. And the fertilizers used on lawns tend to be nitrogen rich because that's what turf grasses really like. And so nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium tend to be in poor abundance in soils, but are necessary for the life and growth of plants. So by providing it in excess, you can get really luscious growth. So something that's important to differentiate is that fertilizers can be inorganic or organic. And the big difference between those two is that organic fertilizers feed the soil. So this can be things like compost or animal manure that you add, and it actually gets integrated into the soil. Whereas inorganic, or sometimes it's referred to as synthetic or mineral fertilizers, really focus on just feeding the plant and don't really get integrated into the soil layer as much. So for the focus of this talk, when I say fertilizers, I mean the synthetic or mineral fertilizers, not so much the compost, but we'll touch on that a little more at the end. So pesticides and herbicides. And I know I'm rushing and there's a lot of information, but thankfully this talk is being recorded. So if there's anything I'm moving through quickly, I would encourage you to return and revisit this talk to get a little bit more information. So we love our chemicals on our lawns. Over 80 million pounds of pesticides are used on lawns annually. There's actually, if you go to like the Home Depot or to pick up fertilizers or pesticides or herbicides, you usually will find combination bags that are kind of marketed as weed and feed. So with one application, you can both remove plants that are non-desirable from your property while feeding the plants that you hope to see. So, you know, removing something like crabgrass while really feeding all of your turf grasses. So the most commonly found chemicals include 2,4-D, which is short for 2-dichlorophenoxytic acid, and then glyphosate, which is the active ingredient in Roundup, and atrazine. Atrazine is less commonly used on yards. It's more frequently used now in an agricultural setting, but about 10 years ago, you would have seen atrazine on the market. Each of these 2,4-D, glyphosate, and atrazine are broadleaf pre-emergent herbicides, meaning that they kill anything that's not a grass. So that makes it really desirable for cornfields because corn is technically a type of grass. And on turf grass, right? Because you just want those turf grasses. You don't want any like dandelions or other herbaceous plants growing in your monoculture. I will note that exposure to these chemicals are linked to certain cancers, but that research is ongoing. I do really want to emphasize at this point that this is not meant to shame yards or the chemical treatment of yards. Rather, this talk is more to empower you to make good decisions and ask questions to your maybe service provider or to yourself if you're out looking for chemicals to use on your property. So I want to focus on one particular herbicide, which is very commonly used, glyphosate. This is the active ingredient in Roundup, and it's used in over 750 other herbicides. So 750 is an average number. Every year, herbicides are put on the market and removed from the market. They're rapidly developing and adapting and adjusting the chemical formulations. So that makes keeping up with the research kind of challenging because it takes time to do epidemiological studies looking at the impact on humans and environmental studies looking at the impact on the environment. So I want to put that caveat in there because there's a lot of information here, and depending on where you get your resources, it may vary depending on who's doing the research. But there is evidence that glyphosate toxicity exists at concentrations lower than what regulations deem safe. So these regulations are constantly changing and adjusting to try and find the safest exposure level to humans. But the World Health Organization's cancer authorities, who are called the International Agency for Research on Cancer, determined that glyphosate is probably carcinogenic. That probably carcinogenic is an actual designation. That isn't just like a flippant, it's probably dangerous. This is a real designation, and it was given in 2015. And the World Health Organization does not accept funding from any development, any companies that are developing these chemicals, which oftentimes the United States will accept money to do this research, but it introduces a kind of bias. So when you are looking into the chemicals being used maybe on your property or on your neighbor's property, always be sure to try and find non-biased research evidence, like the World Health Organization. So of the 80 million pounds of herbicides and pesticides used annually on yards, 5 million of that include glyphosate. That's really important because oftentimes glyphosate is labeled as a water-safe herbicide. If you take nothing away from today's discussion, take away the fact that this is not true. Glyphosates are in no way safe to use near bodies of water. The research shows that the impact on stream communities is dramatic when glyphosate enters the system. So macroinvertebrates are any non-vertebrate, so lacking a spine, animal that lives in the waterway that's visible to the naked eye. So this can include mussels and clams, as well as insects and snails. And when glyphosate is entered or is introduced into an aquatic environment, biodiversity can decrease very rapidly. And that is distressing because many of these macroinvertebrates tell us a lot about the quality of water in the stream. So when you lose a lot of biodiversity, it destabilizes the entire community because these organisms are what feed the rest of the food chain. So if you, like trout, want to look for them in streams that have a robust population of things like mayflies and stoneflies, and those are the things that disappear first when glyphosate enters the system. It also can reduce the rate of larval growth in a number of different stream dwelling organisms. And this is critical because these animals live on a timeline. So they need to spawn in the spring. When the spring arrives and they're half the size they need to be, their spawn are going to be much weaker and less successful in life. It just kills amphibians. Amphibians breathe through their skin, and so they're very, very sensitive to any novel chemicals in the system. They very quickly absorb it through the skin and into the body. They are one of the first groups of animals to start to disappear when you have chemical contamination in an otherwise healthy system. What's interesting, and this research is still ongoing, but Roundup is shown to be more toxic in the stream to macroinvertebrates than just glyphosate alone. And this is likely due to the inclusion of that chemical 2,4-D that was introduced on the previous slide. Excuse me. So if you can avoid using glyphosate, please do, and definitely try to avoid using it in sensitive wetland areas and riparian areas. So we're going to switch over to an insecticide called permethrin. This is, it goes by the name Nix. and it's used for treating yards for ticks and mosquitoes. So at its heart, this was developed to be an insecticide to kill insects. So it's not surprising that it's highly toxic to both freshwater and estuarine organisms. And there have been a wide variety of studies looking at permethrin and its impact on aquatic systems, and found that in almost every scenario, the levels entering the waterway were high enough to kill freshwater and estuarine fish, invertebrates, and the biofilm, these organisms like diatoms, bacteria, and fungi that exist in the stream that work to break down organic matter. So things like leaf litter and tree branches that fall in the stream. Without a healthy biofilm, the rest of the food chain collapses. It is also, it can introduce a chronic risk in an aquatic environment, which means that it lingers. So it's not something that just washes in after a rainstorm and washes out, but it washes in and then hangs out for a while and can cause long-term dysfunction in an aquatic ecosystem. It is also highly toxic to honeybees. And what's interesting is permethrin is part of a larger school of insecticides, which every year another 2 or 3 are removed from the market in the European Union, where their criteria for dangerous chemicals vary from the United States. So usually we're behind by a couple of years as we are collecting and analyzing the data. But permethrin works by interfering with the neurological pathways in an insect's brain. And so it has been shown to cause disorientation and death in honeybees. I only picked 2 because there are so many pesticides to choose from, right? We know glyphosate's used in almost 800 different herbicides. So this is a really handy table to look and see what the impact of different pesticides can be. So on the right, you have herbicides, insecticides, and fungicides. And then across the top, you have if it's been detected in groundwater, if it leaches, if it's toxic to birds, toxic to aquatic organisms and fish, toxic to bees, and toxic to mammals. And what's really interesting about this table is that by every X are a series of numbers. And what's not shown are the several pages of references to scientific studies that have shown these results. So no matter what you pick, it's likely to have, if you're using a pesticide, herbicide, fungicide, algicide, it's likely to have a negative impact on an aquatic system. So that was a lot of heavy information, and I hate being the bearer of negative news. So I wanted to take a quick breather and talk about soil infiltration. And soil infiltration is the ability for soil to allow rainwater or any water to permeate into the soil. So what's fascinating about lawns and landscapes is that lawns can actually act like pavement, an impervious surface. And if something is impervious, it does not allow water to move through it. Water either sits on top or runs off, versus a pervious surface, which allows for water to infiltrate into the layers of soil. So what's interesting is that turf grass itself is not an impervious surface, but during construction, we bring in heavy machinery and earth movers to compact and level and adjust the landscape to put houses on. What's interesting is that those heavy machinery pieces can alter the physical property and the hydrologic characteristics of the landscape, which can reduce the rate of infiltration. So what's interesting is basically we then cover up a hardened landscape with a roll of green carpet. We call it grass, and then we call it a day and water it once to twice a day all summer. And what makes it a roll of carpet and almost not much more effective, right? It's because grass, or turf grass particularly, has a very interesting growth habit where the roots on a grass plant will only grow to half the length of the blade. So if you're maintaining your yard at 1 inch all summer long, what is below that 1 inch of grass is half an inch of roots. So the shorter your grass is, the more maintenance it requires, because as those roots it tries to grow, it can't grow down, so it kind of grows out and creates this very thick mat, which can contribute to the difficulty of water entering the soils. So the longer you let your grass grow, the deeper the roots can begin to grow into that hardtack soil that might be underneath. So when we're thinking about what ways we can make small, substantial changes that are going to positively impact our waterways, letting your grass grow a little longer can make a big difference. And this is a change that many HOAs will accept. Oftentimes, like if you can let your grass grow to be knee high, that'll have a bigger impact. But if you double the length of that grass blade, that means you probably have to mow less frequently, maybe every other week versus every week. And your grass is going to be more efficient at collecting and retaining water. So, not everyone is familiar with plant growth habits, but this table does a really wonderful job showing how native plants have adapted to handle periods of drought. So on the left is, in the red circle, is the root system of turf grass, and in this table they chose Kentucky bluegrass as their example. And then all of these other roots these are mostly prairie plants, but the root systems of plants native to the East Coast are very, very similar. So the roots on native plants tend to be far more robust. They grow much deeper. And because of that, they require less water because they can access more of the soil system to pull water from. And they also help to start break apart that hard soil. If you think about, your lawn in late August after it's been sun-baked and you're trying to dig a hole, how difficult it can be. These native plants really start to break that up a little bit more. And when rain falls in that area, more of it is going to soak into the soil than the grass, where it might sit on top or will run off. So this leads us into a transition of how to be a good streamside neighbor. And the fact that you're attending or listening to this talk has already showed me that you care, and that your ability to even start to consider the changes that we can make already puts you in a really great place. And I recognize that many people don't have the choice on how their property is being maintained. So we have a variety of different potential options that you can start to consider for adjusting your behaviors on your property to increase water quality for your nearest water body. So the first and probably most obvious thing I'm going to share is think native. So when we talk about building meadows, there's sometimes this assumption that lawns are evil, get rid of all lawns, meadow everything. And if you have the ability and the will, that's amazing. If you don't, but you want to make a difference, you can just start with a corner of your property, where you could start with one plant. And even putting in one small native plant on your property can go a very, very, very long way towards improving the habitat quality for things like birds and other pollinators. And it does really, really help with the water quality, right? Because if we have one plant with a robust root system in your property, then that's one area where the water is going to be able to absorb into the soil more efficiently. And if you're thinking, I'm really just not comfortable, or maybe my HOA has a finite list of plants that we're allowed to plant on our property, maybe you could start with just considering letting your grass grow a little longer. Altering your mowing schedule could save you maybe a Saturday morning a week, every other week, to let your grass grow a little longer. And just remember that that rule of thumb, right? That the roots on turf grass grow to half the length of the grass blade. So if you are using fertilizers, of course, the first recommendation is stop using fertilizers, but we know that's not an option for everyone. So if you can reduce the use of inorganic fertilizers, that's awesome. Maybe consider switching to organic fertilizers and focus on amending the soil and improving your soil health and quality. So things like compost and manure make really good alternatives to the synthetic soil or synthetic fertilizers. When you're applying your fertilizers, always apply on cool spring days. So you want the growing period to have started for plants. You don't want to apply when it's too hot or too cold. So on a day when the high is going to be between 60 or 70 degrees is perfect. If it's too cold, the plants are not going to be as efficient in uptaking all of those nutrients that you're introducing. If it's too hot, you run the risk of scorching your plants and causing yellow spots on your lawn or in your garden area. And always check the forecast to be sure that it's not going to rain later that day that you're applying these chemicals. You're going to lose money and be less efficient if you do all of this application of fertilizers, whether it's organic or synthetic, if it then just washes all the way downstream. So do yourself a favor, check the forecast whenever applying fertilizers. If you're considering using pesticides and herbicides, the first recommendation would be reduce or stop the use if possible. If that's not possible, or you really just can't stand the look of crabgrass, or you have children and you're worried they're going to hurt their feet when they're playing in the yard, maybe consider switching to organic alternatives. If you have the mobility and the time for hand removal, that's ideal. Then you can really target the plants you want to remove. But I recognize that takes a lot of time, and it takes a certain level of mobility that not everyone has. So there are other organic weed killers like vinegar or corn gluten that you can use that are readily broken down in the natural environment. So you don't have to worry so much about it washing into the stream where it might persist for days to months. Also, carefully read the label on any any pesticides or herbicides that you're using to check for dilution requirements. Oftentimes there will be a dilution factor like 1:1 where you want half of the chemical and half water. So you want to check, because if you're applying a concentration that's too high, you run the risk of damaging the health of your property, and definitely increase the risk of runoff, carrying concentrated poison basically into our waterways. So always check the label. And again, check the weather. Just like with fertilizers, you want to be sure that there's not rain in the immediate forecast. And if you're using a sprayer to apply your pesticides or herbicides, check for any strong winds or breezes. You want a good calm day with no crosswinds for applying a lot of these chemicals, because the last thing you want is to accidentally have your broadleaf herbicide spread over to your tomato bed in your garden, because you'll very quickly lose all of those tomatoes. You also want to reduce the risk of having it spread to property that's not yours. So always check for rain and wind. And most often labels will have temperature ranges for maximum efficiency. So check to be sure that it's not too hot or too cold to apply your pesticides or herbicides. And then if you are considering a spot treatment, or rather than spray your entire yard, say for dandelions, you could spot treat. So just go to individual dandelions and treat them directly. A great resource to learn more about how to do that efficiently is the Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture. So, we recognize that stopping cold turkey isn't really an option for a lot of people, but if you can start to be smarter about how you're applying these things to your property, it can really go a long way to improving both the efficiency of your purchases and your application, as well as saving the habitat that could be downstream from you. So if you have a lawn care professional who's doing all of this, maybe on behalf of your HOA or other regulatory body, consider asking some of these questions. So what herbicides, pesticides, or fertilizers are you using on my property? What's the purpose of those chemicals? And are you familiar with what you're treating on my property? Oftentimes, the plan is developed by someone who is not able to attend every application step. So you want to be sure that the team working on your property is aware of what the purpose of their work is. When and how often are you applying pesticides, herbicides, or fertilizers to my property? Do you check the weather forecast? Sometimes people are given a schedule, and every third Wednesday they visit your property to do everything that they need to get done and don't necessarily come on the most opportune day. So can you talk to your lawn care professionals about adjusting their schedules to be sensitive to the weather forecast when visiting your property or your neighborhood? And a good question to ask is, every lawn care professional team is managed by someone who has a pesticide application certification. So it's worth asking, there is a certified applicator present during the application of certain chemicals, or if not, how much training has your applicator had? And it's really helpful to develop a friendly relationship with these lawn care professionals. Their job is to make your property look the way you want it to. And so by having a running dialogue with the people visiting your property, you can more easily get to a place where you're behaving in a sensitive way to your needs, and they're accomplishing their goals. Oftentimes, many lawn care services will have like a low chemical or organic option. So it's worth talking to your applicators to see if that process is available for your property. So I know this was a ton of information, and I went through it pretty quickly, but before we move on to questions, I would like to share some upcoming talks by the Trust. This Thursday, we have an amazing talk by Elise Carrere, who is a filmmaker and National Geographic explorer, who's presenting Adaptation, Creatively Living on a Changing Planet. On Wednesday, April 21st at 7 p.m., if you haven't gotten tired of hearing my voice, we're going to be discussing stream exploration, discovering Ridley Creek. So this talk is all about your area, the health of Ridley Creek in the headwaters. So if you want to learn more about the biology and chemistry of Ridley Creek, I'd love to see you there. And then a talk that, if all the discussion of feeding the soil and organic fertilizers got you really interested, learn more about why soil health matters with Fred DeLong, the head of our farm program, as we discuss the incredible documentary Kiss the Ground, Thursday, April 22nd. So I really want to extend a huge thank you for letting me come and talk today and share more. And I want to give a shout out to my colleague, Mike Cranny, who gave an incredible talk last Thursday about choosing the right native plants for your property. That talk was recorded and the recording is available. I would like to also thank my coworker, Anna Willig, who contributed to putting this talk together. So with that, I'd like to open the floor to questions. Thank you so much for your attention.
So thank you. Thank you so much, Lauren. We have a few questions that have come in while you were speaking. I guess the first question is, will your talk on 421 be substantially different from this evening's?
Yes, it will. While we might touch a little bit on, maybe some of these fertilizer and chemical inputs in our waterways, it's really going to be focused more on the history and current health and function of Ridley Creek.
So the next question that we have is someone who's asking, they have a wild strawberry and clover on their lawn in big patches. Last year I sprayed vinegar and dishwashing soap and the weeds came back. What options do I have?
So strawberry is a tricky one. That's a really good question. I would say, Penn State Extension has a lot of really great information about specific problem plants and how you can treat them in a variety of different ways. So I would recommend maybe starting there and looking. It's hard to say specifically what might work best. I'm not a plant biologist or a botanist. I'm an aquatic ecologist. So I think my number one recommendation would be to do some targeted research, and maybe, the clover is a hard one to remove as well. So, but it does provide a lot of pollination benefits, as well as some food benefits. It is edible, so you could start by eating your unwanted plants.
So we have another question is from Michelle Truitt, one of our board supervisors, who's on the call tonight. She said, this was a terrific discussion. I know that you will be discussing the Ridley Creek, but do you know anything about Chester Creek? We have a little problem with a returning beaver. This beaver has been a problem for many, many years.
Unfortunately, I don't do any research in Chester Creek, but Ridley Creek has been having an emergence of beavers lately as well, the last couple of years. Beavers are a really interesting issue because they're, in my opinion, not necessarily a bad thing. They actually show that there's a fairly healthy ecosystem in place if they're choosing your waterway to call home. However, they are incredibly disruptive. So I would be happy to talk more about beavers and beaver biology. Usually the solution is rehoming them, but there is somewhere downstream a very productive family because we keep seeing young beavers moving upstream, and every year they get a little closer to a couple of tree plantings that we have been maintaining, and it's always a concern that one day we're going to walk out and half of our trees will have been consumed. So while I can't direct you to Chester Creek, I would be happy, Shell, to talk to you more about beavers.
Okay, thank you. Another question from a SAC member. If my yard connects to other lawns, how do I control my own lawn organically while other neighbors use chemicals?
That's a really good question. That is really, I think, one of the major challenges towards making some of these changes. I think one of the great things about neighborhoods and neighbors is that you live next to each other, so you can always strike up a conversation. Many people use a lot of chemicals on their property because they're less aware maybe of what the impacts might be. So if you're worried about cross-contamination of chemicals from your neighbor's yard, start a conversation with them. It's always nice to be really friendly. Don't lecture, don't be condescending, right? If sharing a lot of the information maybe you learned today. And on your own property, I think just be very conscientious of the work that you're doing. Anytime you switch kind of out of the norm, right, it can raise a lot of questions. So starting to have open dialogues with your neighbors in a friendly way might help them to see why you're making the changes that you're making. So I hope that answered your question.
So here's an interesting data fact. It's not really a question. It's just somebody indicating that you had mentioned there was 49,000 square miles of lawn in the United States, and they're saying that there is 46,000 square miles in the entire state of Pennsylvania. So that 49,000 square miles of lawn in the United States covers both the state of Pennsylvania and Delaware, with 1,000 square miles to spare.
That is such a mind-blowing perspective. Thank you to whoever shared that statistic.
So
That
maybe
is,
next time, instead of mentioning Greece, you can sort of mention that it covers the entire state of Pennsylvania and Delaware with 1,000, blah, blah, blah.
yeah, that is much more relevant. I know I've never been to Greece, so when I saw that, I only could base it on the map. So I've been throughout our state, and that is a mind-blowing size. So thank you so much to whoever shared that.
So one last question here. Are there any state projects used to lay down sod or grass, switching to buffalo grass due to its very large root structure? Does buffalo grass do well in this area?
So if I'm understanding the question, is buffalo grass being used instead of turf grass by the state, and does it do well in our area? You know, I can't speak to the state changing their regulations, or if I know I've seen buffalo grass popping up more frequently as a recommended grass. It does do well in Pennsylvania, and it grows, its roots grow 1 to 3 feet deep compared to turf grass, which tends to be much more shallow. It is slower growing. However, buffalo grass can handle hot summers and cold winters. It's a prairie grass from the western part of our country. I know I've seen it around in people's yards. It seems to be a pretty well-behaved plant, even though it's not native to our region. So it could be a good option to substitute in parts of your yard if you were interested in switching out your turf grass, but maybe not ready to take the plunge into a meadowed section of your lawn. So that's
So
a great question.
we have one more question from Robert. It's a pretty good question. He says, excellent session. My first question is, how does one dispose of chemicals such as Roundup? Your talk convinced me to get rid of this chemical. Also very interesting about the root structure of grass. What is the ideal length when cutting my grass?
Ooh, good questions throughout. Let's start with the disposal of chemicals. I would definitely don't dump them down the drain. I would contact either your waste collections people to see if they will pick it up, and if not, poison control usually will take pesticides and herbicides. So you can start with doing research to your local waste management organization. And definitely Penn State Extension would have lots of information, and the Pennsylvania Department of Environmental Protection would have more pointed information on how to get rid of those chemicals. And I am thrilled that you are considering getting rid of them and moving towards a less synthetic management strategy for your property. That just fills me with so much joy. Thank you. So the best length to mow your grass, there's actually recommendations based on how much sun your yard gets throughout the year as to the mowing strategy. So I would look to see, does your lawn get 6 to 8 hours of full sun every day? If so, you can look online to find the best recommendations. So without knowing your property very well, it's hard for me to make a well-informed recommendation for your land management strategy. So sorry, it can't be more detailed.
Hey, Lauren, we not only like beautiful green lawns, but we also like our mulch. Talk to me about mulch. Good, bad, indifferent?
Oh, well, I guess it really depends on the type of mulch. So if you can find organic, non-dyed mulch, that's ideal. So if you go to Home Depot, usually you have a rainbow of mulch colors to choose from. Try to get one that's not dyed orange or black, because that dye will eventually leach out, and it's supposed to be soil safe. But as we've seen, sometimes the research on how safe things are might lag a little bit behind how things are sold. But my opinion, mulch is a good thing. It helps augment the soil. It helps retain moisture. And so that reduces the amount of watering that you need to do for your plants. It also, if you're mulching around a tree, can help protect trees and shrubs from pests like voles, who really love chewing all along the edge of your tree, and they can actually kill otherwise healthy trees from snacking on them. So I'm very pro mulch. Just be sure that when you are mulching, especially around trees, you don't form what we call a mulch volcano, where you mulch all the way up, because that can cause rot at the base of your tree and decrease its health and eventually kill it. So you want to make a donut kind of around the tree, so the base of the tree is able to still breathe and it doesn't start to rot. And there are also non-woody mulch alternatives, so things like pine bales, which I think are pretty commonly used in the South. They're usually less expensive and easier to find organically. And all it is a bundle of usually longleaf pine needles, and you can use that if you have a pine tree in your yard. It looks more natural, right, than if you only have maples or deciduous trees. It looks a little out of place sometimes. So that might be an aesthetic choice, but definitely pro mulch. So great question, David. Thank you.
Thank you.
Lauren, before we let you go, we just want to let our audience know that there will be a follow-up session because Lauren has so much to share. And she will be joined by Mike Cranny, who led the presentation that you all gave on Thursday night, so that you all can then give us some more specific advice on what to plant once we decide to give up at least part of our green expansive lawn. I just thought we might mention quickly perhaps one or two trees or flowers or bushes that people might want to start with before we can get back to them. So I've been reading and hearing a lot about the milkweed because of the monarch butterflies. Would you say that's the first thing or one of the most helpful flowering plants to purchase? And there are lots of places that one can purchase those. Would you agree with?
Absolutely. I love milkweeds. So what's nice about the milkweed family is that there are a number of different plants. So if you don't like the kind of tall, the standard looking milkweed with the big pink flowers, there's a wide variety of all different growth habits. So you can get lower kind of varieties of milkweeds with different colored flowers. So if you're looking for a good kind of a damp spot in your yard, there's beautiful milkweeds that'll thrive in that area, and all of the milkweeds provide the benefits to the monarch butterfly.
Great.
So,
would you say a dogwood or a redbud might be the best choice if you're purchasing a sapling or even a slightly larger tree to start?
Yeah, well, it will depend on the amount of sun that, wherever you're hoping to plant your tree. Let's see, I think I actually have some supplemental slides about this. So alternatives for common species, and this is directly borrowed from Mike Cranny's talk on Thursday. So if you're buying a lot of perennials from Lowe's and Home Depot, some good replacements could be native sunflowers. Heliopsis is one of my very favorite. It grows a little taller, but provides beautiful bright yellow flowers all summer long. Native asters come in all different growth habits and colors, and they usually bloom a little later in the summer. And then native goldenrods are fantastic. If you planted just one native sunflower, one native aster, and a native goldenrod, you'll have beautiful color all year long. Well, from spring through fall, and so many pollinators on your property, you won't know where to begin with identifying. And then, you know, Mike really could speak very eloquently, I think, towards how to choose the right trees for your property. So starting with identifying the trees that are already present and doing well, and working from that list to find good substitutes, I think would be the smartest way to do it. So hopefully Mike can join us for the next talk and provide a little more detail into how to best choose plants for your property. So
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Lauren. And any additional questions that any of our attendees may have, you can just send them along to our email at sac@eastgoshen.org. And we'll look forward with great anticipation to having Lauren back along with Mike. And we look forward to many collaborations with Willistown Conservation Trust. Thank you so very much for joining us, Lauren.
well, thank you so much for having me. This was an absolute pleasure. Your questions were wonderful, and I really look forward to hearing success stories, hopefully in the future. So yeah, please feel free to reach out with any questions. My email was also included in this presentation, and Christy has it as well. So thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thanks, Lauren. Good night.
Good night.